knows her own children. She can tell by the color of the flames, by the way they dance and flicker, whether the heat is right for the task at hand. She knows that the pale yellow flames are too cool for searing meat, that the deep orange glow with its steady burn is perfect for the slow cooking of grain porridge that will feed her family through the morning hours. This knowledge was not learned from any book. It came from years of watching her own mother, from countless mornings spent crouched beside the hearth, adding twigs and logs with careful precision, learning the language of fire through trial and patient observation. In the countryside of medieval England and France, the seasons dictated everything. Spring brought the tender green shoots of early herbs, the first wild onions pushing through the soft earth, and the eggs from hens that had survived the harsh winter months. The cook would gather these gifts with practiced hands, knowing without measurement how much wild garlic would make the porridge savory without overwhelming the delicate grain, understanding instinctively that 3 eggs would bind the coarse barley bread, while 4 would make it too heavy for daily eating. Summer arrived with its abundance, but even abundance required wisdom to manage. The kitchen gardens behind the cottages burst with vegetables that had been carefully tended through the growing months. Cabbages sat heavy and round in neat rows, their outer leaves dusty from the summer heat that moved through the house. Onions hung in braided strings from the rafters, their papery skins rustling softly in the warm air that moved through the house. Beans climbed wooden poles, their pods swelling with the promise of winter sustenance, while herbs grew thick and fragrant in whatever corner caught the morning sun. The medieval cook moved through this plenty with the confidence of long practice. She knew that the beans, when picked young and tender, could be eaten fresh in the summer months, boiled simply in water with a handful of salt from the precious store kept in a covered pot near the hearth. But she also knew that most of the crop must be left to dry on the vine, the pods turning brown and brittle in the autumn sun until the beans inside rattled like small stones. These dried beans would be soaked through the long winter nights and cooked slowly with whatever meat could be spared, creating the thick, nourishing stews that would keep her family alive through the cold months ahead.
Autumn brought the great work of preservation. The kitchen became a place of intense activity as the cook prepared for the lean months that would surely come. Cabbages were layered with salt in great wooden barrels, weighted down with stones to press out the water and create the sauerkraut that would provide precious vitamins when fresh vegetables were only a memory. Apples were sliced thin and laid on wooden frames to dry near the fire, their sweet flesh slowly concentrating into chewy rings that children would suck on during the darkest days of winter. The process of making these preserved foods required no written instructions. The cook knew by the feel of the cabbage leaves, by their crisp snap between her fingers when they had been salted enough to begin their transformation. She could tell by the color of the drying apples, by the way they yielded to gentle pressure when they had given up enough moisture to store safely through the months ahead. This knowledge lived in her hands, in her eyes, in the subtle understanding that came from years of repetition and careful attention to the small signs that nature provided. Winter cooking was perhaps the most challenging time, when the cook's skill and memory were tested most severely. The stores of preserved food had to be managed carefully, stretched to last until spring brought new growth. The dried beans soaked in precious water, swelling slowly back to life in the wooden bowl that sat near the fire. The cook would test them with her fingernail, pressing gently against the skin to judge when they had absorbed enough moisture to cook evenly. Too little soaking, and they would remain hard and indigestible, no matter how long they boiled. Too much, and they would fall apart in the pot, creating a mushy gruel instead of the hearty stew that could satisfy working bodies through a day of hard labor. The fire itself required constant attention during these cold months. Wood was precious, gathered laboriously during the warmer months and stored in carefully ranged piles that had to last until spring. The cook learned to bank her coals at night, covering them with ash to slow their burning while keeping the heart of the fire alive until morning. She knew how to build up the heat gradually, adding kindling and then larger pieces in a sequence that had been practiced so many times it had become automatic, as natural as breathing. In the cities, cooking was both easier and more complex. Easier because there were bakers who provided bread, tavern keepers who sold prepared food, and markets where ingredients could be purchased rather than grown. More complex because city dwellers often lived in smaller spaces, sometimes sharing cooking facilities with neighbors, and because they depended on trade routes and merchants for many of their ingredients. The urban cook of the 14th century lived in a world of shared knowledge and community wisdom. In the narrow streets of medieval Paris or London, neighbors exchanged information about where to find the best flour, which merchant sold the freshest fish, and how to tell when meat had been kept too long in the warm weather. This information flowed naturally through daily interactions, passed along with gossip and news as women gathered at the public wells or met in the market squares. The city kitchen was often smaller than its country counterpart, sometimes nothing more than a corner of a single room with a small brazier for cooking. But even in these cramped quarters, the principles remained the same. The cook relied on her senses, her memory, and her understanding of how ingredients behave under different conditions. She knew that fish must be cooked quickly over high heat to keep the flesh from falling apart, while tough cuts of meat required long, slow cooking to become tender enough to eat. The tools available to these medieval cooks were simple but effective. Iron knives, their blades worn thin from years of sharpening, could slice vegetables paper thin or chop through tough sinew with equal ease. Wooden spoons, carved from local hardwood and polished smooth by countless stirrings, were used to taste and test the food as it cooked. Clay pots, formed by local potters and fired in communal kilns, held their heat evenly and could withstand the thermal shock of being moved from fire to cold stone without cracking.
Each pot had its own personality and purpose. The large iron cauldron that hung from chains over the fire was perfect for boiling large quantities of water or making the thin ale that served as the daily drink for most people. Smaller clay vessels were better for delicate tasks like warming milk or cooking eggs. The cook knew intimately how each pot behaved, how quickly it heated, how evenly it distributed warmth, and how long it retained heat after being removed from the fire. The daily rhythm of cooking followed patterns that had been established over generations. Morning began with the rekindling of the fire, the careful building up of heat from the banked coals of the night before. The first task was always to prepare the morning meal, usually a simple porridge made from whatever grain was available. Oats in Scotland and northern England, barley in the eastern regions, wheat where it could be afforded. The grain was measured not with cups or spoons, but by handfuls, the cook's cupped palms serving as a consistent measure refined through years of practice. The porridge cooked slowly, stirred occasionally with a long wooden spoon to prevent sticking. She could tell by the sound it made, the gentle bubbling that changed pitch as it thickened when it was nearly ready. She knew by the way the spoon moved through the mixture, by the resistance it offered when the porridge had reached the proper consistency. A pinch of salt added at just the right moment would enhance the grain's natural flavor without making the dish too salty for children's palates. While the porridge simmered, other preparations continued. Bread dough mixed the night before and left to rise slowly in the cool air was shaped into loaves and placed in the clay oven built into the side of the hearth. The oven had been heated earlier by building a fire inside it, letting the flames burn until the clay walls glowed with stored heat, then raking out the coals and ashes before sliding in the bread. The cook could judge the oven's temperature by holding her hand inside and counting slowly. If she could hold it there for the count of 8, the heat was perfect for bread. Less time meant the oven was too hot and would burn the crust before the inside was properly baked. The afternoon brought different tasks and different rhythms. With the morning meal finished and cleared away, attention turned to the evening's food. This was often the main meal of the day, the time when the family gathered to share whatever bounty their labor had provided. Planning this meal required foresight and careful management of resources. If meat was to be part of the evening meal, it had to be prepared with particular care. Fresh meat was a luxury for most people, available only when an animal was slaughtered or during the brief hunting seasons when peasants were allowed to take small game from the lord's forests. More commonly, the cook worked with preserved meats, salt pork that had been cured in the autumn slaughter, dried fish that had been purchased from traveling merchants, or occasionally poultry from the family's own small flock. Salt pork required long soaking to remove the excess salt that had preserved it through the months of storage. The cook would place thick slabs of the white and pink meat in a bowl of cold water, changing the water several times as the salt leached out. She judged when the soaking was complete, not by time, but by taste, taking small slivers of the raw meat and testing them carefully. Too much salt remaining would make the finished dish inedible. Too little, and the meat would lose the tangy flavor that made it so satisfying. The cooking of meat was an art that required patience and attention. Large pieces were often roasted on spits, turned slowly over the fire to ensure even cooking. She could tell by the smell, by the way the fat sizzled and dripped into the flames below, how the cooking was progressing. She knew that the meat should be turned when the skin began to tighten and pull away from the flesh, that it was nearly done when the juices ran clear rather than red when pierced with a knife. Vegetables were prepared with equal care, but different techniques. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were often added to pots of boiling water or broth, their cooking time judged by firmness when pierced with a knife point. Leafy greens required only brief cooking, just long enough to wilt and soften, their bright color fading to the darker green that signaled they were ready to eat. The adult flavor of bright greens was not always appreciated by children, and the cook might add a dash of olive oil or some cooked bacon to make the dish more palatable to the younger ones.
The seasoning of food was perhaps the most subtle art of all. Salt was precious and used sparingly, added by pinches rather than spoonfuls. Herbs were gathered fresh when available, their flavors varying with the season and weather conditions. The cook would learn to taste and adjust constantly, adding a bit more of this or that until the balance was right. She knew that sage complemented pork, while thyme brought out the flavor of chicken, that a touch of mint could brighten a heavy stew, while rosemary made lamb more digestible. Spices were rare and expensive, available only to the wealthy or on special occasions. When they could be afforded, they were used with reverence and careful consideration. A single peppercorn might be crushed and added to a pot of meat, its heat spreading through the dish and awakening the appetite. Cinnamon, more precious than silver, was reserved for feast days and celebrations, its sweet warmth transforming simple fruit into something magical. The cook's knowledge of these flavors was not written down anywhere. It lived in her memory, built up through years of tasting and experimenting. She remembered that the herbs gathered in the morning, when the dew was still fresh on their leaves, were more potent than those picked in the heat of the afternoon. She knew that dried herbs were different from fresh ones, more concentrated in some ways, but lacking the bright notes that only came from living plants. Bread making was perhaps the most complex and demanding skill in the medieval kitchen. The dough had to be mixed with just the right proportion of flour to water, kneaded until it developed the proper texture, and allowed to rise for exactly the right amount of time. Too little kneading, and the bread would be heavy and dense. Too much, and it would become tough and chewy. The rising time depended on the temperature of the room, the strength of the yeast, and dozens of other subtle factors that the experienced baker learned to judge by sight and feel. The cook could tell when dough was properly kneaded by the way it felt under her hands, smooth and elastic, no longer sticky, but not yet tough. She knew it had risen enough when it doubled in size and felt light and airy when gently pressed. The baking itself required constant attention. The loaves turned and moved to different positions in the oven to ensure even browning. Water was another crucial element that required careful consideration. Wells might provide clean, sweet water, or they might yield liquid that tasted of minerals, or worse, contamination. Rivers and streams were often polluted by the waste of upstream settlements. The cook learned to judge water by taste, smell, and appearance, knowing that cloudy water might make people sick, while clear water from a trusted source could be used safely for cooking and drinking. The preparation of ale and weak wine was as important as cooking food. These mildly alcoholic beverages were safer to drink than water and provided necessary calories for working people. The brewing process required precise timing and temperature control, all judged by experience rather than written instruction. The cook knew that the grain must be soaked until it began to sprout, then dried and ground before being mixed with hot water. The temperature of this water was critical. Too hot, and it would kill the natural yeasts needed for fermentation. Too cool, and the process would not begin properly. Fermentation itself was monitored by sight, smell, and taste. The cook knew that the mixture was working when bubbles appeared on the surface and the liquid began to smell yeasty and alive. She could judge when the fermentation was complete by the way the bubbling slowed and stopped, by the clearing of the liquid as the solids settled to the bottom. The final product was tasted carefully, its strength and flavor adjusted if necessary by blending with fresh water or by adding herbs for flavor. Preservation techniques were essential skills that every cook had to master. Smoking, salting, and drying were the primary methods available for keeping food safe through the months when fresh ingredients were not available.
Smoking meat or fish was an art that combined the right wood, the proper temperature, and precise timing. Different woods imparted different flavors. Oak for a strong, smoky taste. Apple for something milder and sweeter. Hickory for the rich flavor that complemented pork so well. The fire had to be managed carefully, producing steady smoke without too much heat, which would cook the meat too quickly and prevent proper preservation. The cook could tell when smoked meat was ready by its color, texture, and smell. Properly smoked fish would be firm to the touch, its skin darkened and slightly leathery. The flesh would flake cleanly when pressed with a fingernail and would have absorbed enough smoke to keep it safe for weeks or even months when stored in a cool, dry place. The knowledge that made all of this possible was never written down in the form we would recognize today. There were no measurements in cups or teaspoons, no temperatures in degrees, no timing in precise minutes. Instead, there was a deep understanding of ingredients and techniques that was passed from person to person through demonstration and practice. Young girls learned by watching their mothers and grandmothers, by helping with simple tasks and gradually taking on more complex responsibilities. They learned to judge doneness by sight, smell, and touch, rather than by any external measure. They developed an intuitive understanding of how ingredients behaved under different conditions, how flavors combined and complemented each other, and how to adjust and adapt recipes based on what was available. This apprenticeship system extended beyond the family to include servants in wealthy households and young people who worked for neighbors or relatives. A girl might spend several years working in the kitchen of a manor house, learning not only basic cooking skills, but also the more elaborate techniques required for feast preparation and the management of large quantities of food. The seasonal rhythm of cooking created natural cycles of learning and practice. Spring brought lessons in using fresh herbs and young vegetables, in adapting cooking techniques to take advantage of tender new ingredients. Summer taught the skills of preservation and storage,
of managing abundance and preparing for scarcity. Autumn focused on the great work of preparing for winter, while the cold months provided time for perfecting techniques and planning for the next year's cycle. This cyclical nature of cooking meant that cooking knowledge was reinforced annually, with each season providing opportunities to practice and refine specific skills. A cook might make sauerkraut only once a year, but the annual repetition ensured that the technique remained fresh in memory, and that improvements could be made based on the previous year's results. The evening meal was the culmination of the day's cooking efforts. This was when the family gathered around the single table or sat in a circle on wooden stools, sharing the food that had been prepared with such care. The cook served from the pot with a long-handled ladle, judging portions by eye and by her knowledge of each person's needs and preferences.
The sharing of food was accompanied by conversation about the day's events, plans for tomorrow's work, and news from neighbors and travelers. The cook listened as she ate, gathering information that might affect her future meal planning. Word of a merchant arriving with salt or spices, news of a neighbor's successful harvest, information about which foods were available in the local market. All of this influenced her decisions about what to prepare in the coming days. After the meal was finished, the cleanup began. Wooden bowls and spoons were scrubbed with sand and water, their surfaces scoured clean and then dried near the fire. Clay pots were washed carefully, their porous surfaces requiring gentle treatment to prevent cracking. Iron implements were cleaned and dried thoroughly to prevent rust, then rubbed with a bit of fat to protect the metal until the next use. The fire was banked for the night, the coals covered with ash to slow their burning while keeping the heart of the fire alive until morning. The cook made final preparations for the next day's cooking, setting out ingredients that needed to soak overnight, checking the stores of preserved food to plan tomorrow's meals, and ensuring that everything was ready for another cycle of feeding her family. As night falls in our medieval village, as the last embers of the cooking fires die down to glowing holes, we can appreciate the quiet mastery that made such cooking possible. In the absence of written recipes, in the simplicity of tools and ingredients, there was something profound and enduring about the way people nourished themselves and their families. The medieval cook worked with a knowledge that was alive and responsive, built through countless repetitions of daily tasks and refined through generations of accumulated wisdom. She understood that cooking was not just about following instructions, but about developing a relationship with food, fire, and the natural world that provided sustenance. This relationship required patience and attention, qualities that were naturally developed through the slow rhythms of medieval life. The cook could not hurry the rising of bread dough or force meat to cook faster than the fire would allow. She learned to work with natural processes, to understand and accommodate the inherent timing of ingredients and techniques. The knowledge she possessed was deeply embodied, living in her hands and senses rather than in written words. She could feel when dough had been kneaded enough, smell when bread was perfectly baked, hear when the bubbling of a stew indicated it was ready to serve. This sensory knowledge was more reliable than any written instruction could be.
because it responded to the infinite variations in ingredients, weather, and conditions that affected cooking. The sharing of this knowledge created bonds between generations and communities that went far beyond the simple transmission of techniques. When a grandmother taught her granddaughter to make bread, she was passing on not just a skill, but a way of understanding the world, a connection to the land and seasons that had sustained their family for generations.
The flexibility of unwritten recipes allowed cooks to adapt constantly to changing circumstances. When certain ingredients became unavailable, when economic conditions changed, when new foods were introduced through trade or discovery, the experienced cook could modify her techniques and create new combinations that made the best use of what was available. This adaptability was crucial for survival in an uncertain world where crop failures, political upheavals, and natural disasters could dramatically alter the food supply. The cook who could make nourishing meals from whatever ingredients were available, who could stretch limited resources to feed her family, who could preserve food successfully through difficult times, such a person possessed skills that were literally matters of life and death. In this quiet world of cooking without recipes, where knowledge lived in memory and skill resided in practiced hands, we find something that speaks to the very essence of how humans have always nourished themselves. The medieval cook, working by firelight in her simple kitchen, connected to the rhythms of season and weather, responsive to the needs of her family and community, represents a way of understanding food and cooking that was both practical and profound. Her legacy lives on in the intuitive cooking that still happens in kitchens around the world, in the grandmother who cooks by taste and feel, in the baker who knows by touch when bread is ready, in all those who understand that the best cooking comes not from following written instructions, but from developing a deep, patient relationship with the ingredients and techniques that have nourished humanity for thousands of years. In the gentle smoke rising from cottage chimneys, in the rhythmic stirring of wooden spoons in clay pots, in the quiet satisfaction of a family well fed, we find the timeless art of cooking by memory, by instinct, and by love.